Everyone laughed when 22-year-old Sarah Whitmore walked into a flooded Kentucky field carrying 300 dead branches. The bank was closing in. Her father begged her to sell, and the county experts warned that every single branch would rot beneath the muddy water. But Sarah had found one sentence in her grandfather's old notebook. "Don't fight the water. Give it somewhere to live." So she planted every last stick. Then summer came. The rain disappeared. And when the worst drought in years began killing farms across the county, something impossible was still growing in Sarah's field. Spring rain had fallen over western Kentucky for nearly 2 weeks. Beyond the Whitmore farmhouse, the low fields had disappeared beneath brown water, while cold wind bent the bare sycamores along the swollen creek. Sarah Whitmore stood beneath the sagging porch roof and watched another piece of her inheritance vanish beneath the rain. At 22, Sarah was a small but wiry young woman, barely 5'4", with a narrow face, gray-green eyes, and long chestnut-brown hair she usually tied behind her neck with a faded ribbon. Her fair skin had begun to freckle from outdoor work, though her hands still carried more ink stains than calluses. Until 3 months earlier, she had imagined becoming a schoolteacher in Louisville. Then her grandfather Samuel died, and the future she had carefully pictured seemed to close like a book in the middle of a sentence. Samuel Whitmore had left her 56 acres outside Paducah, a weathered farmhouse, 2 barns, an aging tractor, and $11,800 in debt. The bank had given Sarah 90 days to prove the property could produce enough income to justify extending the loan. Otherwise, the farm would be sold. Sarah had 47 days left. Her father, Robert Whitmore, believed there was still time to escape. Robert was 48, broad-shouldered and thick through the chest, with a square jaw, deep-set brown eyes, and dark hair turning iron gray above his ears. A short, carefully trimmed beard covered the scar along his chin from a machinery accident when Sarah was a child. He worked repairing farm equipment in Paducah and treated uncertainty like an enemy. Years earlier, he had watched one failed harvest nearly bankrupt Samuel, and the memory had hardened his faith in practical things. Wages, machinery, numbers that could be written clearly on paper. "Sell it before the bank sells it for you," Robert told Sarah that morning. She knew he meant it kindly. That almost made it worse. Frank Dalton had already offered enough for the property to clear the debt and leave Sarah with money for Louisville. Frank, 55, owned several hundred productive acres bordering the Whitmore place. He was a heavy, powerful man with a sun-darkened neck, pale blue eyes, a broad reddish-gray mustache, and the easy confidence of someone accustomed to having his advice accepted. He could be generous when generosity cost him little, but success had given him a habit of mistaking certainty for wisdom. Sarah had placed his written offer on the kitchen table the night before. She had almost signed it. Instead, after breakfast, she walked through the rain toward Samuel's old storage barn, telling herself she was only cleaning it before the sale. Inside smelled of damp timber, engine grease, and forgotten summers. Sarah spent 2 hours sorting rusted tools and empty jars before pulling several rotten seed sacks away from the rear wall. Something wrapped in burlap lay behind them. She dragged it into the light. 3 bundles. Sarah untied the first and stared. Sticks. Hundreds of them. Gray, dry branches about 2 feet long, some as thick as her thumb. She broke a small end from one. The wood looked lifeless. "Grandpa, what in heaven's name were you saving these for?" Beside the bundles lay a black notebook. Sarah recognized it immediately. Samuel had carried notebooks everywhere. He had been a lean, long-limbed man with weathered skin, enormous hands, and silver hair that refused to stay beneath his hat. He rarely argued with anyone. He simply watched longer than other people did. After losing Sarah's grandmother 12 years earlier, Samuel had become quieter still, spending evenings walking the creek banks as though the land itself provided company. Sarah opened the notebook. Most pages contained rainfall dates, creek levels, sketches of routes, and observations she barely understood. Then she noticed a red thread marking one page. The handwriting was Samuel's. "When the low field floods ankle deep, plant them. Don't fight the water. Give it somewhere to live." Below it were 2 words. "Old willows." Sarah looked toward the barn door. Beyond the rain, the lowest field was underwater. Her heart began beating faster. It was ridiculous. Frank's offer was real. Louisville was real. Teacher training was real. 3 bundles of dead willow branches were not. Yet Sarah remembered Samuel kneeling beside that same creek when she was 9, telling her that land could speak if a person stopped trying to answer before listening. By noon, she had carried the first bundle outside. By 1 o'clock, she was standing calf-deep in brown water. The mud sucked at her boots as she pushed the first willow cutting deep into the soft earth. Then another. Then another. Word traveled quickly. By mid-afternoon, 2 neighboring farmers had stopped along the road. Frank Dalton appeared beside the fence soon afterward, rain dripping from the brim of his hat. When he realized what Sarah was doing, he laughed. "Girl, farmers plant things to make money. Nobody buries firewood in a swamp and calls it agriculture." Sarah heard the laughter behind him. She kept planting. Robert arrived before sunset. He stood beside the fence, his work jacket darkened by rain, staring at the rows of bare sticks. "Sarah." She stopped. His face held no anger now, only fear. "Please don't lose your future because you're afraid to let go of his past." The words struck harder than Frank's laughter. Sarah looked at the flooded farm, then at the mud covering her hands. Perhaps that was exactly what she was doing. But perhaps Samuel had left those branches for a reason. "I need to finish, Dad." Robert lowered his eyes. After several seconds, he turned toward his truck and drove away. Sarah continued alone. The cold entered her fingers first, then her wrists. Her shoulders burned. Twice she slipped and fell to one knee. Each time she stood again. 100, 200, then the last bundle. By dusk, nearly 300 bare willow cuttings stood above the muddy water. Sarah walked slowly back toward higher ground and turned. In the fading Kentucky light, the flooded field looked like a cemetery, hundreds of crooked wooden markers rising from brown water. She had 47 days left, almost no money, and no proof that a single one of them was alive. For the first time all day, Sarah allowed herself to be afraid. Then she closed Samuel's notebook against her chest and looked once more at the strange field she had created. Everyone else saw dead wood. Sarah desperately hoped her grandfather had seen something they could not. By the third morning after Sarah finished planting, the rain had erased nearly every footprint she had left in the low field. Only the crooked tips of the willow cuttings remained above the brown water, and from the kitchen window, they looked less like a crop than the wreckage of something already lost. News traveled quickly through the farms outside Paducah. Some neighbors called Sarah stubborn. Others called her foolish. By the following Tuesday, the story had reached the county agricultural office, and shortly before 10 that morning a dark green government sedan stopped beside the Whitmore barn. Dr. Henry Collins stepped out carrying a leather field case. He was 51, tall and narrow through the shoulders, with a long angular face, thinning sandy gray hair, steel-rimmed glasses, and a neatly clipped mustache that made his serious expression seem even stricter. Henry had spent 26 years advising Kentucky farmers through floods, insects, crop diseases, and disastrous planting decisions. A fungal outbreak early in his career had ruined several farms after growers ignored his warnings, and since then he had become cautious almost to a fault. He trusted measurements because experience had taught him how expensive hope could become when mistaken for evidence. Sarah met him near the flooded field. Henry examined several cuttings, then pushed a soil probe into the mud. "Heavy clay," he said, "saturated almost completely. They're willows. I can see that." He glanced toward the hundreds of gray stems. "Were these freshly cut?" "No." "How old?" "I don't know." That answer troubled him more than anything else. Henry explained that saturated clay contained little oxygen and that old cuttings might have lost too much viable tissue to establish roots. Even willow, tolerant of wet conditions, was not immortal. "I'm not telling you nothing can survive here," he said. "I'm telling you not to build your financial future around 300 unknown cuttings." Sarah looked across the water. "My grandfather lived here almost 60 years. I'd like to give him one chance to be right." Henry studied her, perhaps expecting an argument. None came. Finally, he closed his field case. "Then document everything." That advice Sarah accepted. She began recording rainfall, water depth, and the condition of the cuttings in Samuel's notebook. The rain continued through April, and the field became deeper. On the worst mornings, only 3 or 4 inches of some stems remained visible. Sarah walked the edge daily but resisted wading among them, afraid of loosening whatever might be happening beneath the mud. Nothing appeared to be happening. Meanwhile, white envelopes from the bank arrived with increasingly formal language. Then Frank Dalton returned. He drove up one wet afternoon and handed Sarah another offer across the porch railing. He had raised the price enough to leave her with several $1,000s after the debt was cleared. "You could be in Louisville before summer," he said. Sarah looked at the number longer than she wanted him to notice. For one dangerous moment, she imagined a dry apartment, clean shoes, classrooms filled with children, and nights when rain against a window meant nothing more frightening than weather. "You don't have to prove anything to dead people," Frank said. Sarah's eyes lifted. Samuel had been dead less than 4 months. Frank seemed to realize too late what he had said. Sarah folded the paper and handed it back. No. By the middle of May, the rain finally weakened. The swollen creek retreated between its banks, leaving driftwood along the fence and a thick layer of black silt across the low field. Sarah waited 2 days before walking out. The willows looked terrible. Gray stems stood beneath a brightening sky without a single leaf between them. She touched one. Dry bark. Another. Nothing. At the third row, something inside Sarah finally gave way. Maybe Robert had been right. Maybe Frank had been right. Maybe Samuel had simply been an old man saving branches he never intended anyone to plant. Sarah wrapped both hands around one cutting. Enough. She pulled. The cutting did not move. Sarah frowned and pulled harder. Still nothing. She fetched a shovel from the barn and carefully dug beside it. 6 inches down, her blade uncovered something pale. Sarah dropped to her knees. From the buried portion of the willow extended several white threads, delicate as sewing cotton. They curved through the black mud and divided into smaller strands. Roots. Her breath caught. She crawled to the next cutting and dug with her fingers. More roots. The third had them too. Sarah began moving from tree to tree, laughing once in disbelief, and then covering her mouth because the sound frightened her. The branches had not been waiting to die. They had been working where nobody could see them. When Henry returned several days later, Sarah led him directly into the field. He crouched beside one exposed root, adjusted his glasses, and remained silent for almost a minute. "Alive?" Sarah finally asked. Henry touched the root carefully. Very much so. He did not apologize for his warning. Sarah did not ask him to. By the following week, tiny green swellings appeared along dozens of stems. Then the first narrow leaves unfolded. June brought warmer mornings, and the transformation accelerated. Gray sticks became slender saplings clothed in silver-green leaves that trembled whenever wind crossed the field. From the porch, Sarah could now see a faint green pattern spreading through the place that had looked like a cemetery only weeks before. Yet one morning after a heavy overnight shower, Sarah noticed something even stranger. The creek had risen. The surrounding ditches were full, but the water in her low field was already disappearing. Sarah walked between the young willows and pushed her fingers into the earth. The mud did not feel the way it had in April. It broke apart more easily. Dark crumbs gathered between her fingers where there had once been only sticky clay. Sarah looked at the young trees. Then she looked down. For weeks, everyone had been watching the branches. Whatever Samuel had understood, Sarah suddenly suspected the real story was happening underneath them. By the middle of June, Sarah no longer walked into the low field simply to see whether the willows were alive. She went there with Samuel's notebook tucked beneath her arm, a measuring stick in one hand, and questions multiplying faster than she could answer them. The change she had noticed after the last heavy rain refused to leave her mind. Before the willows, summer storms could leave shallow water standing across the lowest ground for 4 or 5 days. Sarah knew this because Samuel had recorded it repeatedly. June 8th, 4 days standing. June 21st, 5 days near south fence. July 3rd, 4 days, mosquitoes terrible. Now Sarah began keeping her own records beside his. After the next storm, she drove wooden stakes into 3 locations and scratched marks showing the water level. By the second morning, much of the standing water had disappeared. After another storm, she measured again. The result was similar. She refused to call it proof, but something was changing. Sarah began digging shallow holes between the young willows. The clay farther uphill remained dense and sticky, clinging to her shovel in heavy slabs. Around the willow rows, however, she increasingly found narrow channels running through the soil. Fine roots occupied many of them. Small leaves dropped from the rapidly growing saplings, while bits of grass and broken twigs collected around their bases. The transformation was modest. but Sarah could feel the difference when she crushed the soil between her fingers. One evening, she sat beneath the barn lantern comparing her observations with Samuel's notes. Then she found the sentence again. Don't fight the water. Give it somewhere to live. This time, Sarah understood it differently. Samuel had never been trying to make the low ground behave like the dry farms surrounding it. Generations of farmers had treated standing water as an enemy. They dug ditches, straightened creeks, and tried planting crops that suffered whenever their roots remained wet. Samuel had been thinking about something else, living with the water. The following morning, Sarah walked the entire low portion of the property. Instead of seeing useless wet ground, she began seeing pathways. She marked the shallow depressions where storm water naturally traveled and the slightly higher strips where it slowed. Then she started cutting new willow growth. She did not disturb the original trees more than necessary. From the strongest plants, she selected a limited number of healthy shoots and prepared new cuttings. She planted them in broad strips following the contours of the lowest ground rather than filling the entire field. Between those strips, she left open spaces. Those spaces became her next experiment. Sarah purchased small quantities of moisture-tolerant pasture seed and planted test patches rather than gambling on the whole field. Some failed. One patch became so muddy after a storm that Sarah sank nearly to her knees while checking it and spent 10 embarrassing minutes pulling one boot from the clay. She laughed alone when it finally came free. Very scientific, she muttered. But other patches established. Grass began appearing between the willow strips, thin at first, then increasingly dense where drainage had improved. Dr. Henry Collins returned twice during June. Sarah showed him her rainfall records, but made no grand claims. You're learning, he said. Learning what? To measure before believing. Sarah smiled. Samuel would have hated that sentence. Henry glanced toward the willows. Maybe, but I suspect he measured more than you realize. He simply used 60 years instead of a clipboard. By late June, Sarah had stopped thinking about the field as something that needed to be rescued. It was becoming a system she needed to understand. Frank Dalton saw something very different. He stopped his truck beside the fence one afternoon and stared at the expanding rows. You know what I see? He asked. Sarah continued tightening a strand of temporary fencing. I imagine you're going to tell me. A 56-acre forest nobody will pay you to grow. Then it's fortunate I haven't planted 56 acres of trees. Frank frowned at the grass between the willow strips. You could have taken my money. I remember. You still can. Sarah stood and wiped dirt from her palms. Then why do you keep reminding me? Frank had no answer he wanted to give. He climbed into his truck and drove away. Then July arrived, and the argument changed. The rain stopped. At first, nobody worried. Farmers welcomed several dry days after the wet spring. 7 days became 14. The sky settled into a hard blue dome. By the third week, daytime temperatures repeatedly climbed into the 90s. Dust began rising behind trucks. Corn leaves curled inward during the hottest afternoons, narrowing themselves against moisture loss. Sarah watched the sky every evening. Nothing. The fourth week brought hotter wind. Farm ponds began shrinking from their banks. Pastures faded from green to yellow. By the fifth week, without meaningful rain, conversations at feed stores no longer concerned yields. They concerned water. Sarah became frightened for an entirely different reason. The land she had spent spring protecting from too much water now faced too little. One afternoon, she carried a shovel into the low field, expecting the worst. The exposed ground between distant rows was dry and hardening. But beneath the willow strips, the earth felt cooler. She pushed her fingers several inches down. Moisture. Not everywhere. Not endlessly. But enough. The young trees showed little of the distress visible across neighboring fields. Their silver-green leaves still trembled in the hot wind, and narrow bands of surviving grass remained beneath and between the strongest rows. Sarah stood beneath the July sun and looked across the county. Beyond her fence, corn leaves curled and pastures browned. Behind her, nearly 300 trees that everyone had once feared would drown were still green. For the first time, Sarah wondered whether Samuel's strange lesson had never been only about surviving a flood. Perhaps he had been preparing the land for what came after the water disappeared. August came to western Kentucky like a furnace door opening. By noon, heat shimmered above the county roads, dust hung behind passing trucks, and the fields surrounding Paducah had faded into shades of yellow and brown. Sarah stopped counting the days without meaningful rain after the 6th week. The newspapers called it a severe dry spell. Farmers used simpler words: bad, dangerous, ruinous. At the livestock auction, cattle arrived by the truckload because families could no longer afford to feed animals on pastures that had stopped growing. Sarah heard that Frank Dalton had begun paying a hauler to bring water to his farm twice a week. His largest pond had retreated into a shallow brown basin, and several of his cornfields were too damaged to justify harvesting for grain. The Whitmore farm was suffering too. Sarah never pretended otherwise. The higher pasture had browned, and the garden beside the farmhouse required careful watering. But down in the low field, the difference was becoming impossible to ignore. Every morning Sarah carried her shovel to several marked locations. In exposed ground away from the willow strips, the surface hardened beneath the sun. Beneath the strongest rows, however, the soil remained cooler. When she dug 6 inches down, she could still squeeze dark earth into a loose ball. The young willows cast only narrow shadows, but together with fallen leaves and grass residue, those shadows protected small strips of ground from the full violence of the August sun. More importantly, the trees had spent spring building roots below the surface. Sarah could not see how deep every root had gone, and she refused to pretend she could. But the trees remained green, suggesting they were still reaching moisture available in the low ground long after the surface began drying. Between several willow strips, the pasture grasses Sarah had planted in June were still alive. That mattered because Sarah now had livestock depending on them. Samuel had left behind 6 cattle, 4 mature cows, and 2 young heifers. Sarah had kept them partly because selling them immediately after his death had felt like removing the last living pieces of his daily routine. Now they stood at the fence each morning waiting for feed Sarah could increasingly struggle to provide. Remembering older entries in Samuel's notebook about willow browse, she began cutting small amounts of fresh leafy growth from established shoots and offering it only as supplemental forage alongside the grass and remaining hay. The cattle accepted it cautiously at first, then eagerly. Sarah never stripped a tree bare. She rotated what she cut and watched the animals carefully. By the middle of August, people began noticing. The first familiar car to turn into the Whitmore lane belonged to Henry Collins. This time Henry carried soil sampling tubes, cloth bags, a thermometer, and enough glass containers to make Sarah smile. "You planning to take my whole farm back to the office?" "Only the interesting parts." He collected samples from beneath several willow strips, from open ground between them, and from untreated clay farther away. He measured moisture at comparable depths and labeled every sample carefully. Sarah followed him. "What are you trying to prove?" "Nothing." Henry pushed another tube into the soil. "I'm trying to find out what happened." That answer pleased her. 3 days later he returned. Then he sampled again. The second visit lasted nearly 4 hours. By late afternoon, Henry sat with Sarah beneath the porch roof, his sleeves rolled to his elbows and several sheets of figures spread across Samuel's old table. "The areas beneath your willow system are showing better aggregation than the untreated ground," he said. "There's also more surface organic material, and at the depths we checked, moisture has persisted better." Sarah waited. Henry removed his glasses and rubbed the bridge of his nose. "It doesn't mean willows magically create water. Your low ground naturally has access to more stored moisture. The roots, shade, surface litter, and improved soil structure appear to be helping you use that advantage." Sarah looked toward the silver-green rows. Henry followed her gaze. "I looked at this land as a problem that needed fixing," he said quietly. "Your grandfather may have looked at it as a system that needed understanding." Within days, trucks began arriving. First came a farmer from 4 miles north. Then 2 brothers whose creek pasture had turned brown. Then an elderly widow Sarah recognized from church. Some had laughed at her in spring. Now they stood on her porch asking the same question. Could they have willow cuttings? Sarah could have charged them. She needed money badly enough to calculate what each bundle might bring. Instead, she remembered herself standing calf-deep in April water with nothing except Samuel's notebook and one final chance. So she gave the cuttings away. Not recklessly. The young trees could supply only so much healthy material. Sarah showed visitors how to select suitable shoots when available and warned them that willows would not solve every problem. "Watch where your water already wants to go," she told them. "Start there." 1 truck became 3. 3 became 7. But one person never came. Frank Dalton. Then, during the final week of August, Sarah heard an engine slowing beside the fence. Frank's truck stopped. For several seconds, he remained behind the wheel. When he finally stepped out, Sarah almost failed to recognize the confidence she remembered. His shirt was stained with dust. His reddish-gray mustache seemed untidy, and deep lines had appeared around his tired blue eyes. He walked toward her slowly. No joke. No offer to buy the farm. Frank removed his hat. Sarah. Behind him, across the road, his pasture looked burned nearly white beneath the sun. Then he turned toward her willow rose. Green leaves moved softly in the hot afternoon wind. Frank swallowed. Do you have any cuttings left? Sarah looked at the man who had laughed beside this same fence months earlier. Then she looked at the dying land behind him, and suddenly winning did not feel anything like she had imagined. Frank Dalton received his first bundle of willow cuttings before sunset. Sarah did not ask him to apologize, and Frank did not offer one. Some lessons, she realized, became smaller when forced into words. She simply walked him through the low field, showed him how she selected healthy shoots, and repeated the principle Samuel had left behind. Begin where water naturally traveled. Observe before changing anything, and never assume Sarah's solution belonged everywhere. By October, the drought had finally broken. Rain returned gently at first, tapping against roofs and settling the dust before heavier autumn storms followed. Sarah had spent the preceding weeks preparing cuttings whenever the young trees could safely provide them. Combined with material later taken during the dormant season, the original willow stand eventually produced thousands of viable pieces distributed across the area. Henry Collins helped turn curiosity into something more careful. Working through the county agricultural office, he organized a small trial involving farms with creek margins, seasonal wet spots, and erosion-prone low ground. Instead of promising results, he asked participants to keep records of rainfall, soil conditions, survival rates, and drainage. Some plantings thrived. Others failed. A farmer who copied Sarah's spacing on a dry hillside lost most of his cuttings. Another planted willows too close to a drainage structure and had to remove them. Sarah considered those failures as important as the successes. Whenever someone asked for her secret, she gave the same answer. Don't copy my farm. Learn to read your own. 3 years passed. By the spring of 1957, the Whitmore farm no longer resembled the desperate inheritance Sarah had nearly sold. The original low field had become a patchwork of mature willow bands and open pasture. The trees rose well above Sarah now, their flexible branches moving in the Kentucky wind like green ribbons. Grasses filled the spaces between selected rows, and birds nested where muddy emptiness had once stretched from fence to creek. After floods, Sarah still found standing water. Samuel's system had never promised to eliminate it, but the water spread through ground increasingly protected by roots and vegetation, and the soil in many managed areas had become darker and easier to work as organic material accumulated. Sarah changed too. At 25, she was still small and lean, but 3 years of farm work had strengthened her shoulders and hardened her palms. Her chestnut hair was usually tied beneath an old straw hat, and the uncertainty that once lived constantly behind her gray-green eyes had softened into something steadier. She had learned that confidence was not knowing everything would work. It was knowing failure could teach her what to try next. The farm developed several modest sources of income. Sarah expanded her cattle herd carefully as pasture improved. She sold nursery stock and properly prepared willow cuttings when demand grew. On higher, better-drained ground, she established a vegetable garden that supplied produce to several families and a small grocery in Paducah. She never became wealthy. But one April morning, Sarah walked into the bank carrying an envelope containing the final payment on the farm debt. When she stepped outside again, she stood on the sidewalk for several seconds without moving. For 3 years, $11,800 had felt less like a number than a hand around her throat. Now it was gone. Sarah drove home, but found herself unable to celebrate. Instead, she went to Samuel's barn. She had decided to clean the back shelves properly, something she had postponed through 3 seasons of work. Behind an old wooden box, she discovered several loose pages caught between the wall and Samuel's workbench. One belonged to his notebook. Sarah recognized the handwriting immediately, but these letters were shakier than those in the earlier entries. If Sarah ever reads this, tell her I did not leave her a good farm. I only left her a place that still had the possibility of becoming one. Sarah read it twice. Then a third time. She sat at Samuel's workbench and pressed the page flat beneath her palm. For years she had thought the willows were his gift. They were not. Samuel had left her something far more difficult to inherit, a way of seeing. He had taught her that difficult land did not always need conquering, that something appearing useless might simply be suited to a purpose nobody had recognized yet. That survival sometimes came not from forcing the world to obey, but from understanding what it had been trying to say. Through the open barn door came the whisper of thousands of willow leaves. Sarah closed her eyes. For a moment, it sounded almost like distant rain. Later that afternoon, she walked to the fence where Frank and the others had once laughed. Across the road, Frank was working beside a younger man. His son, Daniel Dalton, 27, had recently returned to the family farm after several years working construction in Tennessee. Daniel was tall and broad like his father, with dark blonde hair, a sun-browned face, and a short beard framing a strong jaw. Unlike Frank's old certainty, Daniel possessed the cautious curiosity of someone who had watched his father's drought losses and understood that experience did not make a man invulnerable. Father and son were planting willow cuttings along their own low pasture. Frank noticed Sarah watching. He lifted one hand. Sarah lifted hers. No speeches passed between them. Behind Sarah, the Whitmore willows moved in the spring wind. Before her, another generation pushed young branches into Kentucky soil. 3 years earlier, nearly 300 dead-looking sticks had stood in muddy water like grave markers. Now they had become the beginning of something alive, and no one was laughing anymore. Sometimes, God does not perform a miracle by changing the land. Sometimes, He changes the way we see it. Sarah spent months believing that the greatest gift her grandfather had left her was 300 old willow branches. To everyone else, they looked dead. The field looked worthless. The flood looked like a problem. And when the drought came, it seemed as though nature had simply found another way to take everything away. But perhaps the miracle had been there long before Sarah understood it. The water everyone feared was already beneath the land. The trees everyone laughed at already carried the ability to grow roots. And the wisdom Sarah desperately needed had already been written down by someone who loved her enough to leave a lesson behind. Maybe God works in our lives that way too. There are seasons when we look at what remains and see nothing but dead branches. A dream that did not happen. A career that did not become what we expected. A relationship that changed. Money that never seems to be enough. A home that feels quieter after someone we love is gone. Or simply the realization that the years have passed faster than we ever imagined. In those moments, we often pray for God to change everything around us. We ask Him to stop the rain. Then, when the rain disappears, we ask Him to end the drought. We ask Him to remove the difficult ground and give us an easier field. But sometimes God's answer is quieter. Sometimes He does not remove the difficult season. Instead, He gives us the wisdom to discover what can still grow inside it. Sarah could not control the flood. She could not control the drought. She could not force the bank to forget the debt, and she could not make her neighbors believe in her. She could only take what had been placed in her hands and faithfully plant it. One branch, then another, and perhaps that is all God asks from us sometimes. Not to understand the entire road ahead, not to know exactly how everything will turn out, but to take the next faithful step with what we have today. Because something that looks dead may still have roots waiting beneath the surface. Something you consider a weakness may one day become part of your strength. And a chapter of your life that feels like an ending may simply be preparing the ground for something you cannot see yet. So if you are walking through your own flooded field today, do not lose heart. Keep listening. Keep learning. Keep planting. And remember Samuel's lesson. Sometimes we spend our lives fighting the very circumstances God may use to teach us where we are meant to grow. If this story touched your heart, please share it with someone who may need a little hope today. Tell us in the comments where you're watching from and what lesson Sarah's journey left with you. And if you believe stories about faith, courage, family, and second chances still deserve to be told, please subscribe to the channel and become part of our community. May God bless you and your family. May He bring peace to your home, strength to your difficult seasons, and wisdom when the road ahead seems uncertain. And when all you can see are dead branches and muddy ground, may God give you the faith to remember. The miracle may already be growing where you cannot see it.